The gavel fell once, and the crowd leaned forward like wolves smelling bread, a slap of sound against winter air at the trading post where men bartered beans, bullets, and names. Dakota territory, late 1870s, wind dragging grit along the boards, a rail spur sighing, a baby crying somewhere behind a freight wagon. On a rough plank set like a gallows step, the girl stood with a number pinned crook to her shawl and shame forced to stand straighter than her spine. $1, the auctioneer called, voice oiled by whiskey and habit, and some men laughed because cruelty sounds cheaper when it's priced. A deacon studied his boots. A banker thumbed coins he didn't need. A boy on a crate tried to see what purity looked like when the world measured it by weight. The winter sun sat low, like a witness too tired to swear. Near the corral, a Lakota warrior watched without blinking, a blanket folded over one arm, hair braided with a single hawk feather that had outlived storms. He'd come to trade furs and salt, not to buy a life, but some roads turn when a man remembers what his grandmother taught. People are not prices. The auctioneer smacked his palm again, eyes hunting for laughter like sparks searching dry grass. $1 to start. Any man with a conscience or without? A gloved hand twitched. The girl's breath hitched and then behaved. Someone shouted a joke the wind stole before it could stain the sky. The Lakota man stepped once and stopped, the way a hunter checks the ground for broken truth. To those who knew him, he was Chaska, firstborn. Not that names matter to a crowd that thinks it owns the air. He listened to the girl's breathing more than the bids, heard how it tried to stay steady like a colt learning the halter. The auctioneer dragged her forward by the elbow, and her shoes scraped wood like a prayer learning to speak. The badge at the rail glinted and did not move, because fear of a banker can weigh more than iron. $1, the man barked again, louder, as if noise could make a lie grow legs. Chaska let the blanket settle over his forearm like a small piece of warmth choosing a body. He stepped into open light where the girl could see a face not sharpened by greed. "Stop," he said, one word clean as water. The trading yard turned toward the sound. Even the horses lifted their heads as if water had been poured. The banker's smile thinned. The sheriff's jaw moved, but his boots did not. Chaska reached into his pouch, not for coin, but for a rawhide ring knotted to a small carved lark like the ones mothers hang above sleeping children. He lifted it to the light as if weighing the sun against the insult. "She is worth more than gold," he said, and every noise forgot itself. "You cannot sell a breath." The auctioneer laughed the way a rusted hinge tries to be a door. "Then buy her, Hunter." Chaska shook his head. "A person is not bought. A town is judged." The girl looked down and up again, as if a door had opened inside her chest and asked to be named. Dust lifted soft across the plank. A lantern behind the freight office caught and steadied, finding gold in the cold. Nobody bid. Nobody breathed, and the gavel that had started this never learned how to fall a second time. The crowd broke apart in murmurs and bootsteps, like a wave realizing it had struck rock. The auctioneer looked for someone to blame and found the wind instead. His gavel hung useless in his hand, the coin he'd expected still waiting for sin to spend it. The girl hadn't moved. Her bare fingers were white at the edges, the rest of her trembling from a kind of cold no-fire fixes. Chaska stepped toward her, slow, deliberate, the way a man approaches a wounded horse. "Come," he said quietly. She hesitated, glancing at the sheriff who still stood watching, badge tilted in the dying sun, guilt hiding behind official silence. When he didn't stop her, she stepped down from the plank, each board creaking like the world trying to remember its conscience. Chaska unfolded the wool blanket from his arm, dark red, patterned in the old way, and wrapped it around her shoulders. For a moment, her shivering stilled. The blanket fell heavy but warm, carrying the smell of smoke and cedar, a smell that didn't belong to cruelty. "You'll freeze before night," he said. "There's a fire east of the ridge." "Why help me?" Her voice cracked halfway through the word me. He met her eyes, quiet as river water. "Because no one else did." He led her from the trading yard toward his horse, a bay mare with snow crusting her mane, and lifted her up gently as if she weighed nothing at all. The crowd watched, silent now, their judgment turned thin in the face of mercy made visible. The sheriff turned away first. The banker spat into the dirt and missed. The matron who'd folded the paper clutched it harder. As if proof could still mean something when compassion had already rewritten the law. Chaska swung up behind the girl, and the horse started toward the hills. The road out of town ran narrow between fences and frost, but the further they rode, the less she looked back. "They'll come," she said. "Let them," he answered. "The mountains got long memory." She tried to speak again, but the words collapsed under exhaustion. He steadied her with one arm. The blanket gathered close around them both, and felt how small her breaths had become. When the first flake of snow landed on his glove, he whispered something old in Lakota, a prayer for those caught between worlds. The wind carried it up the ridge where it scattered into peace. By the time they reached the line of pines, the sun was a dull coin sinking behind the world, and the sound of the town was only a rumor behind them. He stopped once to look back, saw the smoke rising from the auction yard like a warning, and then turned toward the timber trail. She stirred faintly, half awake. "What's your name?" she asked. "Chaska," he said. "And yours?" "They called me Mercy," she whispered, voice barely a thread. "Then that's who you are," he said, "not what they sold." The horse moved on, hooves crunching in rhythm with her breathing. The last light found their path and followed it until the cold claimed the day, and when the stars came, they came soft, as if the sky itself was ashamed of what it had seen. The cabin waited where the pines thickened, its roof bowed by winters that had forgotten mercy, but still standing, smoke curling lazy from a stone chimney like a promise not yet broken. The mare snorted as they approached, hooves muffled in snow that gleamed under starlight. Chaska dismounted first, boots sinking deep, and reached up to lift her down. Her body was light but trembling, a reed too long in the wind. The blanket slipped from one shoulder. He caught it before it fell, tucking it close again, fingers brushing her sleeve, rough leather meeting fragile skin. "You'll warm faster inside," he said, voice low. She nodded but didn't speak. The door groaned when he pushed it open, a wooden sigh that stirred the dust of quiet years. Inside, darkness waited patient until the flint struck, one spark, then another, then fire. The small flame grew with stubborn grace, licking the cold from the walls, painting the furs and hanging herbs in gold and amber. He crouched by the hearth, coaxing the wood to catch, while she stood near the threshold, unsure if this light was truly for her. "Sit," he said, not as an order but as invitation. She moved closer, slow as thaw, and lowered herself to the floor beside the fire. When the warmth touched her face, the color came back, soft at first, then blooming like dawn over the prairie. Her eyes glistened, though not from tears. "I've never seen a man walk away from a crowd," she said quietly. "Crowds are easy," he replied. "They only move one way." He poured water from a canteen into a small pot, set it near the coals. Hard part standing still. She smiled faintly, a small crack in grief that let the light in. "What will they do now?" she asked. "Talk," he said. "That's all they know how." The pot began to hiss. Steam rose between them, carrying the scent of pine and iron. "Where will you go?" he asked. She stared into the fire, voice almost a whisper. "Where a name doesn't cost $1. "Then start here," he said. "Mercy's a good name." She looked at him sharply, as if unsure whether he'd meant the word or her. "It's just what they called me." "Then keep it," he said. "Names given in cruelty can still be kept in strength." He handed her a tin cup of warm water. She took it, fingers brushing his again, this time not by accident. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something alive, like the air after rain. Outside, the wind softened against the logs, less a howl now, more a hum. She sipped slowly, eyes closing once as if the heat reached deeper than her throat. He sat back, resting on his heels, watching the fire throw her shadow long across the wall. "You're safe here," he said. "For now," she replied. "For tonight," he corrected. "Tomorrow's never promised." "Then tonight's enough." The words landed quiet but sure, a truth that didn't need defending. He nodded, then reached for another log, feeding the flame. "You should sleep," he said. "The mountain keeps its own watch." She wrapped the blanket tighter, lay near the hearth, eyes open until the fire's rhythm became her own heartbeat. He stayed awake, listening to the snow settle, to the crackle that sounded almost like forgiveness, learning how to speak again. And somewhere between one breath and the next, The cold outside forgot their names. Dawn came thin and gray, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything. It just shows what survived the night. The fire in the hearth had burned down to its bones, and the air carried that hollow chill that lives between breaths. Chaska stepped outside before the sun climbed the ridge. The snow was deep, fresh, and unbroken, except for 3 lines of tracks that didn't belong to the mountain. Hoof prints, headed uphill. He knelt beside them, tracing the edges with a gloved hand. The frost around them had melted slightly, recent, maybe an hour. He stood, eyes narrowing toward the valley. The air down there was already smudged with smoke. "They're coming," he muttered. Inside, Mercy stirred at the sound of boots. She pushed herself up, the blanket falling from her shoulders, hair loose and tangled from restless sleep. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. Chaska didn't answer right away. He poured a handful of snow into the pot, watched it hiss into water, then looked at her. "Men who think they lost something last night. And you think they'll find it here? Not unless they plan to lose more." He checked the rifle leaning by the door, cleaned, loaded, patient. "You have somewhere to go?" she asked. "Everywhere and nowhere," he said. "But this mountain, she decides who stays." She rose, wrapping the blanket around herself, moving closer to the small window. The frost on the glass made the world look far away. "They'll kill you for helping me." "Then they'll have to look me in the eye first," he said. "Most men can't." She turned, searching his face for something, fear maybe, or regret, but found neither, only calm, carved deep like old stone. "You shouldn't have stopped them," she said quietly. "You could have walked away." "So could you," he replied. "But you didn't." The sound came then, a faint echo of hooves, muffled but climbing, the rhythm of greed with a rifle's patience. Chaska crossed to the door, glanced once at the fire, then at her. "When I say go, you take the back path. It winds down through the birch and meets the river. Don't stop till you see red clay in the water. That means you're safe." "And you?" "I'll give them something else to follow." She shook her head, stepping closer. "You don't owe me that." "Don't mistake debt for decency," he said softly. The first voice called from below the ridge, mocking, stretched thin by the cold. "Hunter, you up there? We got a price left unpaid." Chaska opened the door, the cold slicing in like a blade. "You want your coin," he called back. "Come earn it." His voice carried across the slope, clean and sharp. A crow burst from the trees, black against the pale sky. He turned to her one last time. "Do what I said. The mountain hides those who listen." She hesitated, then reached out, her hand finding his sleeve. "You don't have to be a hero," she whispered. He met her gaze, eyes steady. "Then I'll just be a man who couldn't look away." She nodded once, her lips pressing tight, and slipped out the back into the birch shadows, snow swallowing her footsteps. Chaska watched her vanish, then faced the slope again. The men were closer now, 3 silhouettes, rifles glinting, faces too far to read. He lifted his coat collar, breathed once through the cold, and muttered a single line in Lakota. "Mercy isn't weakness." The wind took it and carried it down toward the valley, where judgment was coming up fast. The first shot cracked through the trees and split the air like a whip. Bark burst from a pine trunk beside him, snow tumbling in small avalanches from the branches above, the sound echoing against the frozen gorge. Chaska didn't flinch. He had known men like these all his life, men who mistook fear for power and cruelty for order. He moved along the ridge, boots silent in the drift, rifle cradled low but ready, the breath leaving him in pale bursts that vanished quick. Another shout followed, laughter behind it. "You think she's worth dying for, savage?" The word snapped through the cold, sharp as the bullet that came after it, grazing the edge of his coat. He answered with silence, the kind that unnerves men who rely on noise to feel tall. He knelt behind a fallen log, eyes tracing the slope below where the 3 riders fanned out. One led, a man in a dark vest and fur collar, the banker's nephew, if the stories were true, the kind of boy who grew into cruelty because no one told him he couldn't. Chaska waited until they came close enough that he could see the frost gathering in their beards. He fired once, not to kill, but to warn. The shot clipped the snow beside the leader's stirrup and sent the horse rearing. The man cursed, grabbing the reins, nearly falling. "You'll pay for that!" he screamed. Chaska rose from behind the log, the rifle lowered now, his voice calm. Already did. Paid with silence long enough. The man snarled and fired back. The shot hit the ridge wall, rock chips slicing across Chaska's cheek, a line of red warm against the cold. You think she's pure? The man spat. She's nothing. Then why chase nothing? Chaska said, stepping forward, slow, deliberate, his breath steady. Because you know she's something you'll never deserve. The man's eyes flared, and in that second, mercy and vengeance wrestled behind Chaska's ribs. He could end it now, a single squeeze, a single flash, and the mountain would never tell. But somewhere in that stillness, he heard the fire from last night crackling, the soft sound of a woman saying, "Thank you," without words, and he remembered what it cost to kill the last of one's peace, so he did not raise the gun. He let it hang at his side, barrel low, and spoke instead. "Go home," he said. "This mountain buries shame better than men do." The second rider spat into the snow. "You won't scare us off." "I'm not trying to." His eyes flicked to the ridge above them, where the snow overhung thick and waiting. He stepped backward once, fired a single round into the ledge. The mountain answered for him. The ridge groaned, the white wall broke loose, and an avalanche of powder and thunder roared down between them. Horses screamed, men shouted, snow swallowing their anger whole. When the sound died, the slope was clean again. Chaska dropped to one knee, breathing hard, rifle across his lap. The silence afterward was the kind that felt earned. He looked down the path where Mercy had gone. Her footprints were gone now too, covered by new snow. He smiled faintly. "The mountain remembers," he whispered. He stood, blood drying on his cheek, and turned toward the trees where a faint trail of smoke, small, hopeful, rose through the birch. The fire she'd built was still burning. By the time he reached the hollow, the sky had gone pale with cold light and the wind had lost its teeth. Smoke lifted from a small ring of stones near the river bend, thin and steady like a promise kept. Mercy knelt beside it, feeding small branches into the coals, her face hollowed by fear but steadied by will. When she heard him approach, she didn't startle, just looked up, eyes wide and tired, the way someone looks when hope arrives late but still breathing. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. He touched the line along his cheek where the rock had grazed him, felt the crust of dried blood. "It's nothing." "They're dead?" she asked. "No," he said. "The mountain buried their hate." "That's enough." She nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders softening, but her hands still trembled as she fed the fire. "I heard it," she said. "The snow. I thought it was thunder." "It was," he answered. "Thunder that listened." He sat across from her, the heat between them small but true, the firelight throwing their shadows long across the white ground. The blanket still clung around her shoulders, edges blackened from the hearth. "You should have run farther," he said. "If they'd split their path, I wasn't leaving you," she said before he could finish. The words came fast, then quiet, as if they frightened her. He didn't smile, but something eased behind his eyes. "You did what you believed," he said. "That's more than most." The fire cracked, sending up a small shower of sparks. "You think they'll come again?" she asked. "Not soon," he said. "Men like that go home angry and tell themselves lies until they sound like law. And the sheriff? He'll look the other way until he can't." She stared at the flames, voice barely moving. "They took everything I had." He looked at her carefully. "Then take it back." "How?" "Start with your name." She drew a slow breath. "Mercy," she said, and the way she said it made it sound like truth this time, not shame. "Mercy Hart." "Good," he said. "That's a name worth keeping." They sat quiet for a while, the river whispering beside them under its thin shell of ice. "Do you ever pray?" she asked suddenly. "Not with words," he said. "The old ones say prayer's just remembering what you're made of." "And what's that?" "Dust, fire, and choice." She smiled, faint but real. "Then maybe I'll remember." 2. He reached into his coat and pulled something small from his pocket, the rawhide ring, the carved lark. It had survived the fall, though the bird's wing was chipped. He held it out to her. "Keep it," he said, "so you don't forget that one good thing still stood up for you." She looked down at it in her hands, eyes filling with a quiet that wasn't sadness, but peace, trying to find a home. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Just live in a way that makes it mean something." The sun broke through then, thin beams sliding between the pines, catching the smoke, turning it to gold. She looked at him through it and said, "You could have killed them." He nodded once. "I could have. Why didn't you?" He looked at the rising light, then at her. "Because the world's already buried enough men who thought killing proved something." She let the words sit there, warm as the fire. When he stood, the light caught his face, and the bloodline down his cheek looked less like a wound and more like a mark the mountain had chosen to keep. The sun had climbed above the ridge by the time they followed the river down, the snow melting into rivulets that flashed like quicksilver between the stones. Chaska walked ahead, rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the line of trees where the trail bent back toward the valley. Mercy followed close, her boots sinking into the softening crust, the blanket tied across her shoulders like armor. Every few yards she glanced behind them, half expecting the mountain to spit the men back out. "They'll tell the town I ran," she said quietly. "They'll tell the town worse," he answered. "But the story won't walk as far as truth." She frowned. "Truth doesn't travel fast." "No," he said, "but it lasts longer when it gets there." By noon, the trees thinned and the sound of the river grew louder. The valley opened before them, a hard, bright expanse dotted with fences, and the faint spire of Copper Bend's church cutting into the sky. Smoke drifted over the town like a scar that wouldn't heal. Mercy stopped, clutching the edge of her shawl. "You're going back." "I have to," he said. "The mountain keeps its own law, but the town's still under theirs. They'll hang you for what you did." "Maybe," he said. "But maybe they'll remember they didn't hang the guilty men last time." He turned to her, voice gentler now. "You don't have to come." She looked toward the open plain, the same road she'd been dragged up only a night before, and shook her head. "If I run now, I'll never stop running." He nodded once. Then we walked together. The closer they came, the quieter the world grew. Doors half open, curtains moving like eyelids trying not to see. The sheriff's horse was tied outside the courthouse, reins hanging loose, the badge glinting on the hook by the door. Chaska stepped up onto the porch, boots echoing hollow in the cold air. Mercy stayed behind him, hands clasped tight. "You don't have to," she began, but he pushed the door open before she could finish. Inside, the room smelled of sweat, paper, and fear. The sheriff looked up from his desk, eyes sunken from a sleepless night. "You should have kept riding," he said. "And you should have done your job," Chaska replied. "They're the ones who tried to kill her. You can't just take justice in your own hands." "Then whose hands is it in now?" The sheriff's eyes flicked to the rifle, then back. "You planning to use that?" "No," Chaska said. "I came to give it back." He set it on the desk, barrel pointing toward the floor. "The mountain already judged. I'm done carrying death." The sheriff looked at him a long moment, then at Mercy, standing small but unbroken by the doorway. "You think walking in here makes you innocent?" "No," Chaska said, voice steady. "Just human." The silence that followed felt heavier than snow. The sheriff rose slowly, walked to the wall, and lifted his badge from the hook. For a second he held it like it might burn him. Then he set it on the desk beside the rifle. "Maybe it's time the law remembered Mercy, too." He nodded once toward the door. "Go, before the banker rides in." Chaska turned, motioning for Mercy to follow. She hesitated, looking at the badge glinting beside the gun, two kinds of power laid down side by side, and then stepped into the sunlight. Behind them, the sheriff sat back down, staring at the empty desk. And for the first time in years, the sound inside the courthouse wasn't judgment. It was relief trying to find its shape. They left the town the same way they had entered it, under a sky too blue to trust and wind that smelled of endings. The people watched from behind their windows, curtains breathing like frightened lungs, no one bold enough to speak a blessing or curse. Mercy walked beside Chaska, her head high but her hands trembling under the shawl. The badge and rifle lay behind them in that courthouse, symbols of a world that had forgotten the difference between law and goodness. The road led toward the river, its water running high with snowmelt, its sound steady and ancient. When they reached the bank, Chaska stopped, staring at the current as if it were reading their hearts aloud. "This water," he said, "it remembers everyone who crosses. Doesn't matter if they're clean or stained. It just keeps moving. Mercy crouched, touched the surface with her fingertips, and flinched at the cold. "Then maybe it can forget me," she whispered. "No," he said. "You don't want forgetting. You want forgiving." She looked up at him, eyes glinting with the river's reflection. "You think there's a difference? Forgetting buries what happened. Forgiving lets you grow from it." He found a flat stone, tossed it across the surface. It skipped twice, then sank. "Both take practice," she smiled faintly, the first unguarded smile he'd seen on her face. "You sound like a preacher again." "Just a man trying to stop the bleeding," he said. She rose, stepping closer to him. "Then what do I do now?" "You keep walking," he said. "You find a place that needs kindness more than comfort, and you build it." She looked at him a long moment. "You make it sound simple." "It is," he said. "The world's what we feed it." She watched the river, the sunlight flashing across the ripples like small pieces of heaven. "You could come with me." He didn't answer right away, just looked up at the sky, where a hawk turned slow circles, wings wide against the wind. "The mountain still has work for me," he said finally. "There are others out here who think they're alone." She nodded, swallowing the ache that rose behind her ribs. "Then this is goodbye?" "No," he said, "just distance." He reached into his coat and drew out the small carved bird, its wing chipped but whole. "If it ever stops hurting, you'll know the healing's begun." She took it carefully, closing her fingers around it like it was warmth itself. "You gave this to me once." "Then I'm giving it back," he said. "It belongs to whoever needs reminding that they're still worth more than gold." A gust of wind rose, lifting her hair, carrying the smell of pine and smoke. The river glinted bright enough to make her squint. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words sat heavy on her tongue. So she stepped forward instead, took his hand, pressed the little carving between their palms. "For both of us," she said. He nodded, the line of his mouth steady though his eyes shone like morning. The river kept talking, endless, gentle, sure. When she finally turned and began walking down the far path, her shawl flared once in the breeze, a red mark against the white world, and he stood there watching until she became a shape swallowed by light. Only then did he whisper her name. The sound carried away on the wind like a prayer that didn't ask for anything, just gave thanks that Mercy had a voice again. By dusk he had climbed halfway up the ridge again, the valley stretching wide beneath him like a scar healing from the edges. The wind moved slow through the grass, brushing the snow into quiet patterns, and the light had turned that honeyed color that makes even old wounds look holy. From up here, he could see the river twisting through the trees, silver as truth, and a single dark speck moving along its edge, her, walking steady, shawl wrapped tight, heading toward a world she hadn't yet named. He watched until the speck became part of the land itself, then turned back toward the mountain trail. His rifle was gone, his pack light, but his heart carried a weight that felt right for once. He passed the place where the avalanche had fallen, now smooth again, no sign of the fury that had saved them. The mountain had covered its own violence with silence, as if ashamed of what it had to do. He stopped there, drew a line in the snow with his boot, and whispered a few words in Lakota for the men who had come to harm and left in fear. "Let the land remember what we forget," he said. Then he kept walking. The trail narrowed and climbed toward a bluff where the first stars were waking. He built a small fire against the stone wall, fed it until it breathed right, then sat beside it, palms open to the warmth. The night here was different, cleaner, lighter, not the kind that pressed down, but the kind that wrapped around like an old song. He took the feather from his belt and turned it between his fingers, its tip catching the glow. He thought about his brother in Clearwater, the woman buried there. The promise he'd made over her grave, to speak when silence cost too much. He had kept that promise now, though it had cost him peace again. He smiled faintly, a man and a mountain sharing the same tired mercy. The fire snapped, scattering tiny embers that rose like the stars trying to come home. He looked out across the valley at the faint lights of Copper Bend blinking far away, and wondered if the sheriff had kept his word, if the badge still lay beside the gun, if someone finally understood that law without love dies faster than truth without proof. A wolf cried somewhere below, a long, aching note that rolled up through the trees and dissolved into the sky. He lifted his face to the sound and whispered back. Not words, just breath. A man and the earth agreeing to remember each other. The fire had burned down to coals by the time he lay back against his coat. Above him, the stars wheeled slow, patient, unbothered. The cold reached for him, but couldn't find him through the warmth that lingered from what he'd done. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since winter began, sleep came without a fight. Before it took him, he saw her face once more, the way she had stood at the river with sunlight on her hands, and he thought, not of sorrow, not of guilt, but of something older, purer. The mountain whispered through the pines, and he could almost hear the words taking shape. The world will call it love, but it's really just remembering what mercy feels like when it finds its way home. The sun rose slow over the ridge, brushing the valley in soft gold that climbed tree by tree until it reached the cabin roof. Smoke curled again from the chimney, steady and sure, like the mountain had decided to breathe with him one more day. Chaska woke to the sound of the world thawing, the drip of melting snow, the wing-beat of a bird testing the air, the quiet stretch of peace that comes after too much noise. He stepped outside, boots sinking into new softness, the light warm against his face. The fire from last night had burned itself into calm red coals, and the air smelled of pine and smoke, of endings that had turned into beginnings. He looked down the valley where the river shimmered and saw the faint trail she had left winding toward the plains. He smiled, small but real. The kind that belongs to a man who has seen cruelty and chosen gentleness anyway. The hawk circled overhead, feathered wings flashing like polished brass in the light. He raised a hand toward it, the same hand that once held a gun, and let it drop, open and easy. The feather at his belt stirred in the breeze, whispering against the leather, its tip catching sunlight just long enough to look like fire. He thought of Mercy's voice at the river, soft, steady, unafraid, and of the words she'd left him with, for both of us. It echoed now like prayer, like the sound of wind through pine needles, impossible to hold, impossible to lose. He walked back to the cabin, the door creaking like an old friend. Inside, the hearth waited, cold but ready. He set a small bundle of twigs, struck the flint, and the first spark caught, tiny, fragile, certain. The flame rose, reaching, remembering. As it grew, he spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear it. "Worth more than gold," he said. The words hung in the air, soft as breath, binding themselves to the wood and smoke. The room filled with light that didn't just warm, it forgave. He sat by the fire, closed his eyes, and listened to the mountain speak through the wind slipping between the logs. Somewhere far below, the church bell of Copper Bend rang, faint, distant, hollow, and he smiled again, because now it sounded less like judgment and more like confession. He reached for his carving knife and the smooth strip of pine wood he kept by the door. With slow, steady hands, he etched 2 simple letters into the grain, M.H. Then below them, a single word, mercy. He blew the dust away, set the carving above the mantel, and the sun found it at once, gilding the letters in gold. The world outside had turned to water and light, the snow giving way to earth, the birds singing as if they too remembered that grace doesn't have to be loud to last. He stepped onto the porch, leaned against the rail, and watched the day begin. The sky opened wide, the color of forgiveness. The hawk wheeled once more, its shadow sweeping over him, and he let the warmth of it settle on his skin. He closed his eyes and whispered the same line he'd spoken the night he saved her, the line that had changed everything. "You don't die here," he said. "You live." The wind carried it down the valley, across the thawing fields, over the river that remembered every name spoken in truth. The mountain stood silent, proud, content, holding their story the way it held its snow, knowing it would melt, but never disappear. And when the first full light touched the cabin roof, the west itself seemed to breathe again, whispering one eternal truth. Even in the coldest land, mercy still finds a home. If this story lit a small fire inside your heart, don't let it go out. Leave a like, Share it with someone who still believes in mercy, and subscribe to Redemption West, where every storm ends in light and every soul gets one more chance to be worth more than gold.